How's it going, everyone? This is Imperial Magistrate, and today I'm doing a tier list for every king or emperor of France or the Frankish Empire, Kingdom, whatever, since Pepin the Short. So I have 53 kings or emperors that make up this list, starting from Pepin the Short from 751 and ending with Napoleon III in 1870. I decided to start with Pepin the Short because he was the one who began centralizing the power of the monarchy. Prior to him, the Merovingian kings were very weak. In fact, Pepin was the Lord of Paris, and he had much more real power than the current king at that time, Childeric III. So he actually overthrew Childeric and declared himself as king. So today I'm going to be ranking every ruler since Pepin and putting them in a standard tier list of S tier being the best and F being the lowest tier. So let's get started. The first one being Pepin the Short. He had reigned from 751 to 768. As I mentioned, he was the Lord of Paris prior to becoming king and overthrowing Childeric. And for basically establishing the Carolingian dynasty and strengthening the crown, I'm going to put him in S tier. He is often, he is obviously overshadowed by his son Charlemagne, but really Pepin laid the foundations for Charlemagne, so I think that's deserving of being in the S tier. Now, next one is actually Pepin's second son and Charlemagne's brother, Carloman. Not many people know about Carloman, and that's because he really only ruled for a few months, as he was the co-ruler with Charlemagne, but Charlemagne deposed him and locked him away, and so for that I'm putting him in F tier. Then there's obviously Charlemagne, and easy S tier, fairly self-explanatory, one of the greatest kings of medieval Europe, one of the strongest leaders, one of the best warriors, and also a great reformer for education and improving his empire, starting the Carolingian Renaissance. After him, his eldest son Louis the Pious inherited the empire. Louis was not nearly as strong as his father, and as you can tell by his name, he was much more religious. He had actually dismissed the courtesans at his court, and for the most part, he did continue much of the Carolingian Renaissance. However, being that he was fairly weak, he was actually usurped, I believe, 2 or 3 times by his sons over his reign. He would be restored. And it only took after his third time when he had finally kind of put his foot down, because those 2 times he did not punish him at all. The third time he finally gave him some punishment, which was basically locking them in their castles and removing their armies from their control, so that obviously they couldn't overthrow him again. But for that, I'm putting him in B tier. Like I said, the empire was still mostly prosperous under him, but being usurped multiple times by your sons and doing nothing isn't the best look for you. After that was his youngest son, who succeeded him in West Francia, which is what would basically become France, as the empire would be split between his 3 surviving sons, including Charles the Bald. And I'm mixed about putting him in C tier or B tier. He wasn't a terrible ruler, and he did do some good. I think I'm going to put him in B tier for now. Alright ruler, kind of a low B though. Definitely worse than his father, and he definitely did kind of start. Well, I guess you could say Louis the Pious did start the decline of powerful monarchs after Charlemagne, but Charles was definitely not much better than his father, though the empire still remained, or the kingdom I should say, still remained fairly prosperous. After him was his son Louis the Stammerer. Now, he was called that due to him being very physically weak and not being able to speak very well, and He was just easily controlled by nobles. Just there was a lot of discontent, and he was just a very weak king. So I'm putting him in D tier. He's not quite F tier, but just not a great king. Just too weak of a character. After him, it was his two sons, Louis and Carloman. Louis was his older son. He's the one I'd be primarily focused on, as Carloman really did not do much. Louis was actually a very good warrior and general prior to becoming king, and certainly he had potential. He reigned for, I believe, just 4 years, 4 or 3 years. But he had died riding his horse. He hit his head on a low overhanging beam, which killed him at just 19 or so. And he had potential. It did seem like he had potential to be a great warrior king, but he just died too young, and Carloman would be assassinated shortly after him. So Louis and Carloman I'll put in C tier. And like I said, it's mainly just for Louis, as Carloman really did not do much. In fact, it's really not known why they were co-monarchs. With the biggest theory that I've read is that the nobility who had actually elected the monarchs thought that they could possibly cause a schism in the kingdom, but nothing really ever came of that. Since, like I said, they both died very early on in their reigns. After those two was their cousin, Charles the Fat, who was actually already king of East Francia and Italy, and as such, he actually reunited the Carolingian Empire and was the last sort of Carolingian emperor. He had reigned from 884 to 887 as king of West Francia specifically, but he was also fairly weak. And again, just another D tier, king. Not a very good ruler. Really, just very similar to what Louis the Stammerer was, and that more or less was the same with Odo, who reigned for 10 years, but he really was just kind of a non-factor. He did not accomplish very much in that time. It should be noted, Odo was actually not related to the Carolingians, and he was actually of the Robertian line, who are actually the ancestors of Hugh Capet. So he was a ancestor of Hugh Capet, whose dynasty would last for a much longer time. Everyone after Hugh are the Capets. After that, there was Charles the Simple, who I believe was actually the son of Louis the Stammerer, and thus the younger brother of Louis and Carloman. And so Charles the Simple, just again, another very weak king. Just not much to really note of him. And I'll put him in F tier. He reigned from 898 to 922 and just did not really accomplish much. There were a lot of Viking raids during his time as king, and he really did not accomplish much at just preventing them from raiding his kingdom. He actually eventually gave into one of them. Rollo eventually made a peace with them, and he formed the Duke of Normandy, the Duchy of Normandy, and that eventually became, William the Conqueror and all that. But for Charles the Simple, though, just not really much to say about him. After that, we get the son of Odo, Robert the First, and just like his father, just pretty forgettable. Not much accomplishments. He was only king for, I believe, about a year, if not less, and just really did not accomplish anything in that short time. Then we have Rudolf, and Rudolf was actually a very solid king. He was a very good warrior, and he had actually led numerous revolts basically against the Vikings. He was able to push back a lot of the Viking presence. So which is something that Robert failed to do. So for that, I'm going to put him in B tier. Not exceptional and not, legendary as I would say is up here. Not um, really at this level or even A tier, but a very good king nonetheless. Very good king. Reigned from 923 to 936. So decently long reign, and he did make the kingdom much more peaceful. After that, we actually get to the Carolingians again. And here we have Louis of Overseas. He was born in England, I believe. And because of that, he was not very popular with the people and not very popular with the nobility. And once again, just another very weak and forgettable king. And it would continue under his son and grandson Lothair and Louis the Do-Nothing. So Lothair, just again, another very weak king. He really accomplished just very little in his reign from 954 to 986. And I believe he might have been even overthrown. So for that, I'm putting him in F tier. And then his son succeeded him and was only king for less than a year. And he was the last Carolingian. Unfortunately, the dynasty ended up, it ended on a very, it didn't end with a bang. It went out with a whimper. And yeah, just another very bad, weak king. He was assassinated very early in his reign. And yeah, this was the last Carolingian king. After that, we get the Capet line, who would reign, starting with Hugh Capet, became king in 987, and his reign finished in 996. Now, Hugh Capet's reign, it really isn't too special in of itself, with the only real main thing being that his dynasty would reign for several hundred years. And almost 1,000 years even. So it is kind of hard to rate him. But one thing he did do to ensure the Capet dynasty would continue, instead of just going back to another Carolingian or another house, was crowning his son as the junior emperor. Or not junior emperor, the junior king, similar to what the Byzantines did with their emperors. So I'm a little hesitant to put him in B tier, but I'll put him in C tier. I think that's mostly fair. After Hugh Capet is Robert II. And Robert II, I will put in the A tier. He immediately started to reform the government quite a bit. He had a lot of issues with the nobles, and he put down them very quickly and secured his dynasty to continue on. After that, we have Philip the First, who reigned from 1060 to 1108. Or not Philip, it was actually Henry. I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Henry the First reigned from 1031 to 1060. And for the most part, he was just kind of forgettable. I'm gonna put him in C tier. Just not really a lot went on with him. Not much of a legacy, I'd say. After that, there is Philip the First, and Philip was much better than his father. He was a much stronger leader, and he had actually built up the military, which would be very important for his son and successor. So Philip the First, I'm actually going to put him in B tier. After that, we have Louis the Lion. And Louis the Lion was described as the first strong king since Charlemagne. Now, although he was known as Louis the Fat, and later on in life he would actually be too heavy to be carried by his horse, he was still a great warrior. He had defended France during the Holy Roman Empire's invasion. He was able to quell the barons and the nobles, and eventually get them to unite to defend from the Holy Roman Empire. So for his comparison to Charlemagne, I think I'm going to put him in S tier. And he also greatly expanded France's territory. So just a great king, in my opinion, a great warrior king. After that was his son Louis the Younger, Louis the VII. And Louis was very similar to his father. I believe he also even participated in the Second Crusades, which did not go very well. One major drawback of his reign was, of course, his annulment of Eleanor of Aquitaine, who, of course, then, for failing to produce a male heir, and thus she went and married the King of England, King Henry, and she had many more children with Henry. And on top of that, they expanded the Angevin Empire, and Louis had actually lost quite a bit of land. But even with that, he was still a very good warrior king, and like I said, very much a lesser version of his father. So I'm going to put him in the A tier. Next is Philip Augustus, Philip II, probably considered one of the best kings of the Middle Ages. He gained the title of Augustus due to his conquest of basically regaining all of the lands that his father had lost and then some. So another great warrior king in this dynasty. He also greatly reformed the finances of France and reduced the debt of the kingdom. And so I'll put him in S tier. Then there was his son, Louis the Lion. He reigned for just 3 years, but even before he had even become king of France, he had almost become king of England. King John was not very popular, and the nobles actually supported Louis when he was the Dauphin to become king of England, and he had actually almost conquered England before the Pope excommunicated him, and King John died, leading to the nobles to expel Louis. But even then, still a great warrior king. Had various military conquests. All of them were very successful. Unfortunately, he had died very early due to dysentery when he was returning to Paris. He probably... I'm a little hesitant to put him in S tier, just because it's hard to really say that he had the same impact as these rulers. But at the same time, he still was a very strong ruler and sort of began what would be France's sort of height during the Middle Ages. So I'm going to put him in S tier. I'm going to leave him there. After him was Saint Louis. Saint Louis, Louis IX, became king after his father's death at just 12 years old, and he reigned for 44 years and died in 1270. And he was obviously named a saint much later, I believe 29 or so years after his death, by the infamous Pope Boniface VIII, who ironically enough had a pretty big feud with Philip IV, his grandson. But Louis the Pious was or not Louis the Pious, Saint Louis was a very pious ruler, a very good diplomat. He had actually made peace with England, and although it wouldn't be too long, eventually the 100 Years' War would happen, but he made peace with England. He was often used as an arbiter for European affairs, and he was greatly respected by all of his peers, all the various European powers at the time, and was very humble. He always wore a hair shirt under his, lavish clothes and everything. And like I said, you really just can't beat sainthood. I would put him in S tier, but the only reason why I'm dropping him to A tier is because his attempts at a crusade were disastrous. The I believe it was in the Seventh Crusade, and he had got captured in Egypt. Then he attempted an Eighth Crusade, but he died before it really got going. So kind of missed potential there. Um, yeah, that's the only real thing that's kind of knocked him out of S tier. Next was his son Philip III, and he was more or less the same as Louis. A very good diplomat, a very fair ruler. You know, he continued to reform the courts to be more fair to the peasantry and to the common people. And he just continued sort of the greatness that his father had left. So I'm putting him in A tier. And next is Philip IV, although I think this is the correct portrait. Don't know why it got mixed up there. But Philip IV, he is very notorious. He had dissolved the Knights Templar, although he did make several great reforms to the kingdom, increasing its bureaucracy and making it more efficient. His feud with the Pope, Boniface VIII, over his power, you know, how much power he should have over the bishops and clergy compared to the Pope, the various wars he got into with him. I'm going to put him in D tier. He's just barely staying out of F. But yeah, he was, you know, very power hungry. Like I said, he had dissolved the Knights Templar, had them executed on bogus terms to basically absolve his debt. And yeah, just a cruel man, in my opinion. After that, he would actually have 3 sons become king and a grandson. But his first one, his eldest, was Louis X. Louis X was another one who reigned for a very short time, but he made a lot of great progress in that short time. He had abolished slavery and serfdom, and he had continued to reform the government and cut down on debt. So putting him in A tier. It's just he died fairly early. I think if he had lived longer, he might have been S tier. Although, you know, like I said, some of it is also impact and just overall legacy. And while his was obviously very important, I don't think it's on the same tier as these kings. After that was his newborn son, as he had actually died a few months before. His son became, or a few, yeah, I believe it was a few months. But yeah, he was born a king, John the First, in 1316, and he was only king for 5 days, as he would unfortunately pass as an infant. So, really, it's kind of hard to rate him, but putting him in F tier just because, you know, really he was a baby. He was a baby, and he, you know, died super young. And there's not much to rate him on. There's nothing to really rate him on. After him, his uncle would succeed him, Philip the Tall. And Philip the Tall, in my opinion, was another very good king. He had actually allowed the Jews to return to the kingdom after they had been expelled. And he also reformed the courts. He ended trials by ordeal. And just continued to have the kingdom prosper and continue to expand it. So I will put him in the S tier. After he also created a more standardized money system, which allowed France to better manage their finance during this time period. So again, continued the great growth of his predecessors And yeah, this actually had a very good period of great kings. Besides, in my opinion, Philip the Fourth. After him, after Philip, he had died without an heir. The crown then went to his younger brother, Charles the Fourth, who reigned from 1322 to 1328, and really just not much of a legacy. Not a good king, not a bad king, just an average one. But he would not have an heir, and this actually led to the end of the senior Capet branch, and it went to a junior branch, the House of Valois. And this is what started the 100 Years' War, as Edward III believed that he was the rightful ruler because I'm pretty sure they were first cousins or something, whereas Philip VI was a more distant relative. But the reason Philip VI inherited the throne was, well, one part just the politics at the time, but as well as the law of succession essentially makes it to where women cannot rule. And Edward was related to the Capet through his mother, but he still made that claim. And then, but regardless, moving on to Philip VI, though, he was very unlucky, and it's ironic that his nickname was the Fortunate, but he was very unlucky. There was the Black Plague. He did not do very well during the 100 Years' War, or the start of the 100 Years' War, the wars with England, and so putting him in D tier. Again, a big part of that was just because of how much the Black Death ravaged France. But that's kind of what separates great kings from bad ones, is making the most out of a bad situation. He just wasn't able to do it. Although I'm not blaming a ton on him, just the circumstances. Next, his successor, John the Good. And I do not think he was actually a good king. I think it was a terrible one. I think I put him in not F tier, D tier. He actually was held in England. He was captive in England for like 4 years, in which Charles V actually had to act as regent. And yeah, he just was not a very good ruler, did very bad against England, lost numerous territories to England. However, his successor, Charles V, reigned 1364 to 1380, really reversed all of that. And he really brought France back into being more likely to win the 100 Years' War. He made great progress against the English. So I'm putting him in the A tier. Unfortunately, his son Charles VI would kind of cost everything. He became known as Charles the Mad. He did have bouts of insanity. He started to believe he was made of glass. He would howl like a wolf. He became overly paranoid of his knights for no real reason. And the worst part came when he had actually signed away his kingdom to Henry V of England. He had actually named Henry as his heir apparent. So England almost basically conquered France then. The only reason it didn't happen was because Henry died before Charles, and his son was just an infant, and so the nobility were able to declare Charles's third son, Charles the Seventh, as the new king. Now, early on in his reign, because Paris was occupied, he had to move his capital to the southern part of France in Bourges. But, in the end, he did basically regain all of the former French territories. He famously had Joan of Arc lead his army, and, for basically ensuring a French victory, putting him in S tier. He really did save France from his father's disastrous reign, almost losing his own kingdom. After him was his son, Louis the 11th, He was known as the Spider. He was a fantastic diplomat, a great character, very well respected by all the European rulers. So, put him in solid A tier. Then there was Charles the Affable, Charles the Eighth. Um, and I forget how they were related. I think he was a cousin of Louis the 11th, but I forget if they were father and son or cousins. But um, Charles is a bit difficult. He had actually waged a lot of wars, a lot of costly wars against the various Italian rulers. Um, he actually became ruler of Naples and I believe the ruler of Milan for a bit, but he would lose much of it over time. Um, and he did put the country in quite a lot of debt. So it's kind of hard to say, but I'm going to put him in D tier, since although his military was very strong at that time, it ultimately kind of amounted to nothing and cost France a lot of debt. After him was Louis the 12th, and I know for a fact that they were brother-in-laws and, second cousins or something. And Louis the 12th was a very good politician. He was able to lower France's debt, even with the wars he had. He never increased the debt. He always managed it very well. He reformed the taxes. He actually lowered it for a lot of the peasantry, put more taxes on the wealthy and the rising classes. I would put him in A tier, but unfortunately he just was not a great diplomat. He would just be outwit a lot of times, and also not a great military leader. He did briefly reclaim Milan, but lost it again. Or actually, I don't remember if he lost. I think he actually did. He might have retained it, but he was not very successful with war or diplomacy and all that. But for maintaining a fair tax system on his people, which made him very popular, and not raising the debts, as well as having numerous construction projects, I'm putting him in B tier. After him was Francis I, who's kind of considered one of the great Renaissance kings during that period. He was a contemporary of Henry VIII, actually, and maybe we'll draw parallels between the two. He was a very strong warrior king as well. He, just like his two predecessors, had a lot of wars in Italy. Some of them went alright, but many of them did not go as well, and he did eventually lose Milan. But he was still a great patron of the arts. He was very close with Leonardo da Vinci, actually. He brought him to France numerous times to commission artwork, and he had bought the Mona Lisa. He also expanded the Louvre Palace, and just you're just a great Renaissance king. So putting him in A tier, France really prospered with art and innovation during that period. After him was his second son, Henry II, and the only real major accomplishment he had was expelling England from Calais. Besides that, just in my opinion, not a lot to write home about. He kind of also began the mass persecution of the Huguenots, the Protestants of France. It kind of started near the end of Francis' reign. Initially, Francis was actually fairly tolerant towards Protestants, but he had changed his mind later on in his reign. Henry II was much harsher to them, and it really just escalated things. So I'm putting him in C tier for that. After him was his 16-year-old son, Francis II, after Henry had died in a jousting accident. Francis was just he was very physically weak. His mother, Catherine de' Medici, kind of controlled him. He most famously married Mary, Queen of Scots. And really, he just didn't do much. He, like I say, was kind of just at the will of his mother. Um, he continued to make the tense relation with, the Protestants worse. Things just got worse under him, and he wasn't ruler for very long. I think he was only ruler for um, like 7 or so months. So, just a very weak king. Then there was his younger brother Charles, who became Charles the Ninth, and Charles again was a puppet of his mother. Um, Always being controlled by her, and the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre happened under him. For that, I'm putting him in F. Then the last Valois king, Henry III. And Henry III, he finally did sort of break his older brother's patterns of just being puppets to Catherine de' Medici. Unfortunately, there's just really not much that he did to improve the kingdom. So the war of religion just continued to go on. But he was definitely an improvement over his brothers, though. So I'll put him in C tier. After that, we have the Bourbon dynasty. And the first one being Henry IV, who was the actually king of Navarre. It had separated when Philip VI became king. And the Navarre line split from France, and now it was reunited under Henry after he inherited the throne. He was a very distant relative of Henry III, and he got very lucky to inherit France. He was actually raised Protestant, but he converted to Catholicism, and because of that, he was very tolerant towards Protestants. He signed the Edict of Nantes, which granted civil liberties and protections to the Protestants of France. And it basically ended the war of religion in France, although he would eventually be assassinated by a Catholic zealot. But even with that, he still made a lot of great improvements to the kingdom. Greatly centralized the power of the crown, made numerous agricultural developments, and just oversaw quite a lot of economic growth, really laying the foundation for what Louis XIII and Louis XIV especially would improve on. So I believe I'm going to put him in A tier. Not quite S tier, but still a fair position. After Henry IV was Louis XIII, and Louis XIII is fairly interesting. He himself was not always a ruler necessarily. You know what? I'm actually going to change my mind. I'm going to put him in S tier. I think Henry IV deserves it. But yeah, Louis XIII, though, he himself wasn't always just ruling by himself. He had Cardinal Mazarin, who aided him, but he primarily focused on art and music. But still, he put his trust with Cardinal Mazarin, and France just continued to improve. A tier there. Yeah, like I said, just continued the sort of policies of what his father did. Then we have the longest reigning monarch of all time, Louis XIV, or sovereign monarch. I know there were monarchs like the King of Swaziland, who reigned longer, but they were not a independent country. But point is, one of the longest reigning monarchs of all time, Louis XIV. He had reigned for 72 years, 1643 to 1715. A lot happened in his reign. He built the Palace of Versailles, oversaw France become just the dominant power of Europe. Voltaire famously said that the age of Louis XIV was one of the four great ages, and it was the greatest of the great ages. just a lot of economic growth, a lot of cultural development, a lot of artwork, patroned a ton of artwork and music. He also is very underrated for his legal reforms. In many ways, he was kind of in terms of legal reforms, a lesser Napoleon. Um, he passed numerous ordinances to, again, just continue making the courts more fair. He passed Code Louis, which made the law much more uniform in France. Before, it was kind of broken up by region. With Code Louis, though, it was now much more uniform, and it was written down rather than just being by just memory, and writing it down obviously makes it more reliable. Although he didn't abolish slavery in the colonies, he did attempt to make some parts of slavery a bit more humane, such as not separating children from their parents. Still, it is what it is. One major negative, though, or two major negatives, though, were the Edict of Fontainebleau, which essentially revoked his grandfather's Edict of Nantes, which led to mass persecution of the Protestants and a mass exodus of the Protestants to various countries, making France be seen as a major threat. And the numerous wars that he waged, many of them were fairly successful, but quite a few of them, the bigger ones, did end in more or less stalemates. He ended up having to return quite a bit of territories. In the War of Spanish Succession, although he did put his son Philippe on the Spanish throne, it made it impossible. The Treaty of Utrecht made it impossible for France and Spain to unite as one country. But still, I think he is one of the greatest kings in history, and so I'm putting him in S tier. Just was, successful in almost everything he did, and he really kind of, the economic growth. There's a reason why the Enlightenment kind of started in 1715, the last year of his reign, the year he died. It started after 1715 because France had peaked economically, and that's what and education had also greatly improved. He had greatly improved the education systems in France and improved. It also made a standard wage for teachers, but there's a reason why the Enlightenment started kind of in France and was a big factor there. It was really because of Louis XIV and many other great leaders and famous people like Voltaire and even Napoleon would praise him as being a great king, one of the greatest kings. After him was Louis XV, his great-grandson. His eldest son, the Grand Dauphin, had died at 49, and his eldest grandson, the younger Dauphin, died at 30, I believe. And so Louis XV, just like Louis XIV, became king at just 5 years old. He would reign for 58 years, just second longest to the Sun King. But unfortunately, his reign was not nearly as successful, although France would continue to develop economically. Things would eventually start to take a turn for the worse. He made numerous major mistakes, like with the War of Austrian Succession. He returned the lowlands back to... although he did gain, I believe it was called Strasbourg, and did buy Corsica. And he would also continue to greatly patronize art and the sciences. Continued to develop Paris and everything. But really, the wars he waged were just way too costly. Louis XIV, supposedly on his deathbed, even tried to warn Louis XV about this, but he a lot of the wars were too costly. France didn't gain anything. The most infamous defeat was the 7 Years' War, which ended up seeing France lose all of her North American territories. All they really had left was the Caribbeans. Obviously, Louisiana was given to Spain and Quebec to Great Britain. And yeah, just he made numerous mistakes. He was not a strong character, not a strong leader like Louis XIV had been, and it kind of showed sort of the flaws of the system. And a lot of his actions kind of led to the French Revolution, or at least contributed to it. After that, there was Louis XVI, Louis XV's grandson. He became king at 20, and although he was in many ways an enlightened monarch and did believe in decentralizing the power of the crown, he actually restored the parliaments that were suspended near the end of Louis XV's reign by his chancellor, and he did try to implement more regional autonomy. A lot of it would just kind of backfire on him, as whenever he would try to implement real reforms like implementing taxes for the nobility who were exempt and for clergy who were exempt to pay off the debt that had been accumulated under his grandfather and his 2 times great grandfather. He wasn't able to accomplish it. This eventually led to a lot of famines, a lot of poverty, and just led to the French Revolution. I don't think it was necessarily all his fault. Like I said, a lot of it was kind of the system that handicapped him. But in the end, he just was not able to really solve the problems of the country. He did try to compromise at every opportunity. When there was the march to Versailles, he agreed to become a constitutional monarch. He agreed to move his court back to Paris. He agreed to relinquish a lot of power. But ultimately he tried to, escape to Austria, because he did fear that the political order was just moving too far to the left, and eventually it was just really a matter of time before the monarchy would be abolished. And that, of course, led to his execution. Really, I think is more tragic than anything else. But obviously after that, France became a republic, and then a general by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte seized power to be the first consul, and then, of course, he crowned himself as Emperor of the French. And his legacy is obviously very well known, and in some cases kind of infamous. A great general, brilliant general, conquered Europe to the greatest extent since Charlemagne's empire. He also implemented the Napoleonic Code, obviously, which made government much more based on secular reasoning instead of just the ancient traditions and all of that. And that, of course, got implemented in many countries that he had conquered, and that's kind of what led to sort of the modernity and the modern ideas of government and nationalism and all of that. Despite all this, I'm only putting him in A tier, because despite his impact and his legacy, obviously with the Napoleonic Code being the probably his greatest and easily the most lasting part of his legacy, he would ultimately be deposed, and the Bourbons would be restored. He did try to become emperor again, but it lasted just 100 days, and he lost at Waterloo before being exiled once again. But yeah, obviously a brilliant general and a brilliant statesman, but also a controversial legacy to a lot of people. Then there was the younger brother of Louis XVI, who became Louis XVIII. He skipped 17. as a way to kind of pay respects to the son of Louis XVI, who had died in prison, who was considered Louis XVII unofficially. And Louis XVIII, although he was fairly conservative, he also knew he had to kind of ease things back to the old ways. And although he did restore and reverse a lot of what Napoleon had established, he never went too far with it. He did mainly let a lot of the Parliament and his administrators deal with the politics. So for that, I'm putting him in C tier, an alright king. Nothing spectacular, but not as bad as his brother, who would quite literally bring the end of the monarchy, or at least the Bourbon monarchy. Charles was much more of a radical conservative than Louis was, and Charles wanted to just reverse things as quickly as possible. It was not necessarily the worst idea, but he needed to have compromised at times. He needed to have taken things much slower. He kind of thought he could just reverse the entire culture after it had been like 30 years, and just reverse it to how it was during Louis XVI's reign. But it just did not work. Like, you really can't reverse 30, 40 years of a culture overnight. So putting him in D tier, and he was overthrown. I'm just giving him out of F tier because at least he stood by his grounds, and he did begin the conquest of Algeria, and the economy was alright under him, and France had actually begun to slowly industrialize during his reign, which is often overlooked. After him was Louis Philippe I. He was a cousin of Charles, and he is the reason why Charles was overthrown. Louis was actually the son of the Duke of Orleans, who had supported the French Revolution. He would actually eventually be executed himself, and Louis Philippe fled France then. Then eventually he was able to return and form a popular monarchy, form the July Revolution, became known as the July Monarch. And, despite many people viewing his reign as alright, if not forgettable, I think he really did do just irreparable damage to the country. He had tried to merge the liberal Republican ideals with sort of a lot of the older traditions. And as such, he kind of came off as just sort of just being kind of in the middle of everything. And he never went all the way or even really made any real progress of going to the left or right. And he just kind of relied on just a status quo being good and people liking him enough to not fully rebel against him. But that ended in 1848 when the economy had crashed and he had actually censored the press, who had begun to criticize him. People revolted against him, and he ran away. I also want to say that might be more noble, that he didn't want to start another civil war, basically. He didn't want to send the military to put him down. But to me, it just came off as cowardly. He really had the power to maintain. He really had all the assets. There's no reason for him to have abdicated, but he just decided to essentially run away when things got tough. And it was really just because, like I said, he tried to please everyone, and then he pleased no one. He wasn't seen as liberal enough for the, leftists, and he wasn't conservative enough for the rightists. And he really just failed the most at just being what he believed he could be, like that sort of bridge between the Republican liberalism and the conservative traditional monarchy. Then after that we get the Second Republic, where Louis Charles Napoleon Bonaparte, the nephew of the famed emperor, is elected, and he has a coup and dubs himself as the new emperor of the French, Napoleon III. Skipping over II because Napoleon I named his son as co-emperor during his 100-day restoration, though he wasn't ever really recognized. And Napoleon III, though, in many ways I view him like how I view Louis XV. He greatly patronized art and science. He redeveloped Paris, made it much more of the cultural and artistic hub, but his wars were all disastrous. He had attempted to but try to conquer Mexico by, of course, famously putting the younger brother of Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph as the ruler of Mexico, Maximilian Habsburg. He believed he could have used Maximilian as just basically a puppet to enforce French rule. Unfortunately, it turned out Maximilian was much more resilient to Napoleon, and since Napoleon had faked the referendum in Mexico to say that 99% of the Mexicans had voted to establish Maximilian as their emperor, Maximilian genuinely believed that the people supported him and that he needed to put Mexico first before anyone else. And eventually, when the U.S. started aiding the exiled president Benito Juarez, Napoleon pulled his troops out. He actually had made numerous attempts to save Maximilian, but Maximilian refused, believing that he would rather die with his men than to just flee the country. So that was another failure. But what really dropped him down was the Franco-Prussian War, which ended his reign essentially. He got basically played by Bismarck to declare war on Prussia. The war went badly for France, and not only did it end up seeing him be dethroned and go into exile and end monarchy in France for good, but it also kind of began France's sort of decline as the most dominant power in Europe, that now going to Germany. Because even during the reign of Louis XVI, and even during the Bourbon Restoration and Louis Philippe Orleans, France was still arguably the strongest country on continental Europe, especially since a lot of the other countries were still trying to pick up the pieces and recover from the Napoleonic Wars. But Napoleon III kind of began the slow decline of France over time. Like I said, the only thing keeping him out of F tier was that he greatly redeveloped Paris, greatly made it just a lot better, a lot more clean, rebuilt a lot of old housing, kind of turned it into what it is today, or at least the more classical parts of it. But yeah, overall, the Franco-Prussian War and the Mexican expedition just were both disastrous and are what basically put him in D tier. Like I said, in many ways I do view him similar to Louis XV. But I hope you all enjoyed this tier list. If you agree or disagree, you can leave a comment and discuss about it. If you think I should place someone lower or maybe someone else at a higher spot. But we can definitely have a discussion about this. And I hope you all enjoyed, and see you guys in my next video. Spain and Austria, when he could have annexed them